This is an oral history interview with Donn Piatt in his office on December 9th, 1982. The interviewer is Susan Gortner. Mr. Piatt, would you tell us your parents' names and where they were born?
My father's name was Donn Piatt, and he was born in Monticello, Illinois. My mother's name was Catherine Ray Piatt, and she was born on a farm east of Monticello in Piatt County.
And to go back a little bit, since your name is Piatt, can you tell us a little bit about your grandparents? Do you recall them?
I didn't know any of my grandparents except my grandmother Ray, my mother's mother. My grandfather Piatt died in 1888, which was 32 years before I was born, and my grandmother about 1900, grandmother Piatt. And my other grandfather died about that same time. I did know and had a very special relationship with my grandmother Ray. She lived here in town next to the Methodist parsonage where at the present time Fort Dubson lives. And she was left a widow with 8 children on an 80-acre farm, and the youngest child at the time she was made a widow was 6 months old. And she raised those 8 children on that little farm and then moved to Monticello for the rest of her life. I have very fond memories of her.
And you say the house is still there?
Oh yes, it's still there.
Mm-hmm.
It's the house just east of where Reverend Browning lives now.
Where was the farm?
It was down about 6 miles east of Bemet, close to Ivesdale, a mile from the county line. I was almost born in Champaign County.
That wouldn't have been right.
No,
Piatt is the last name.
that wouldn't have been quite right, no.
And you mentioned to me earlier that you knew your aunt, Emma Piatt?
Oh yes. My great aunt.
Great aunt.
She was my grandfather's sister. Yes, she lived in LaGrange, Illinois, and her husband was an architect. Matter of fact, he was the architect and drew the plans for the Monticello High School, the old high school, and also for the Sterling Drug, which used to be the Pepsi Syrup Company when Mr. Moore built it. I knew her very well. She was here, the last time she was here in Monticello that I recall for sure was at the time of the centennial, which was in 1937, and she came down as the guest of the committee, and she was, I think, about 80 at that time, maybe a little more than that. And so she participated in the centennial celebration here.
Did you ever ask her how she happened to come to write a book about Piatt County?
Yes, I did. And she decided I think she graduated in the second class at the University of Illinois. And she then went back home here in Goose Creek Township, in that home that I just showed you a picture of. That was her father's home, and decided that at that time, it was 1883, that there were still enough men and women living in the county that she could get the same oral history that you're doing now. And so she traveled around the countryside and all over the county by horse and buggy, by rail, any way she could get there. And her book reflects what she found out. One of the things that stands out in my mind most about my Aunt Emma from a historical fact is that she told me that she remembered standing on the south porch of that home when her father came back from town and told her that Lincoln had been shot. So that's some connection that far back.
Yeah. Your father, what type of work did he do?
He was with as I mentioned to you before, what we call the syrup Pepsin here. He was an auditor or treasurer there for a number of years, up until shortly after the time that Mr. Allen Moore sold the business, and he retired in about 1934, and then he looked after his farm.
Yeah. Do you know how long your parents attended school?
My father had a high school education. My mother must have gone on, I'm not positive, but she taught school, country schools here for 2 or 3 years before she was married.
What's the ancestral origin of your last name?
You mean from what country?
Mm-hmm.
They came from France.
Do you know when the first Piatts came?
Yes, approximately. They came over before the Revolution and in the early 1700s sometime. I'm not exactly sure as to the date. There were three brothers that originally came over here.
And where did they mostly stay out east then?
They were mostly in New Jersey and then gradually migrated west and into Ohio, and those that's another branch of the family there that I showed you those pictures. And then my great-great-grandfather moved with his family, which there were only 2 then, from Brookville, Indiana, over to what is now Monticello in 1829. And he bought a cabin, really is what it was, from Mr. Hayworth, and that was located down on the highway that goes to Cisco, just before you get to the railroad viaduct. There are twin elms there, I think they are, or no, they're hackberries, twin hackberry trees there, and that is the site of the original cabin, which I have a picture at home. But and then he entered land from the government, and the site of his original farm is now the present site of the city of Monticello. All of the abstracts here begin with the entry from the United States government to James A. Piatt.
You showed me a plaque out in front.
Yes.
Could you share with us about the story about that plaque?
Well, I'll share with you the best of my memory. My great-grandmother, Clorinda Marquis Piatt, who, by the way, was the daughter of Abraham Marquis, some of the earliest settlers here in Monticello, and her father, and which was also my great-great-grandfather, and James A. Piatt were instrumental in laying out Monticello and Piatt County. Anyway, at that time, the way that you got land was to go to the federal courthouse in Danville and do what they call enter it. You make a claim on it, and then you establish that claim, and then it becomes yours by deed from the federal government to the individual. Anyway, she was 17 years old, and this farm was out in Goose Creek. The particular 80 acres that she entered that day is now owned by my cousin Lyndon Piatt. And she heard that there was a man in the neighborhood that was interested in that same 80 acres, so she started out from her home in Goose Creek Township on horseback and rode the 50 or 60 miles to Danville, and this is the story, and I'm sure it's true, that she entered her claim and walked out of the courthouse just as the man that she was trying to forestall, as it says on that plaque, entered it. So she got the 80 acres by about 10 minutes.
Sounds like she would have been an interesting person to know.
Yes, I'm sure she was. And all those people were, they had to be tough, or they couldn't exist. They didn't survive. And she lived to be 75 or 80 years of age, and her husband 91.
On your mother's side of the family, the Ray side, is that right?
That's right.
Do you know where her ancestors?
I have no real knowledge of her side of the family. They originally came from Ireland, but when, I don't know.
Did your mother ever work outside the home?
After she was married?
Mm-hmm.
No.
But she was a school teacher.
Before she was married, yes.
Where did your parents live when they were married then?
They lived here in Monticello. They lived on West Center Street. I think J.P. Meyer lives there now. My father was born here in Monticello, and the house right across north from the Washington School, and I don't know who owns it now. It's a white two-story house there on the corner, directly across from the high school office now, which was the home of Mary J. Piatt, you know.
And where were you born?
I was born on my grandmother's farm in Bemet Township, and I lived there for 2 weeks, and then with that exception, I've lived in Monticello all of my life, with the 4-year stint in the Navy.
Where did your family reside when you were growing up?
They resided then in a house, and where I grew up is on the corner of Center and Market Street, where the National Bank Drive-In is now. The house is no longer there.
What school did you attend?
I attended what we called the North School, but it's the Lincoln School, for 6 years. And at that time, they did not have a 7th and 8th grade, and at the Lincoln School, and we then went to Washington School, or the South School, for the 7th and 8th grade, and then on into the high school.
When did they change the names from the North and South?
Well, I'm not sure, but I couldn't tell you exactly. But when I was going to school, we called it the North School and the South School, and there was considerable rivalry between the two.
And then you went to high school here.
Yes.
And then after you graduated from high school, what did you do?
After I graduated from high school in 1938, I entered the University of Illinois, and I continued there until April of 1942, at which time I was a senior, and also, as everybody knows, at which time we were at war. And the university officials made a special ruling that any senior in his second semester who had an average grade of at least C in the courses he was taking could get his diploma or her diploma if they went into the armed services. And that's what I did in April the 6th, 1942. And I was in the service at the United States Navy for 4 years and 1 day. I got out April the 7th, 1946.
Where did you serve while you were in the Navy?
I served only in the continental limits of the United States. I am colorblind, and I was not allowed on a ship because I couldn't tell the red and green running lights.
That might have been a blessing.
I'm here.
Yes.
I was accepted. I was accepted in the. We had to take the 2 years of ROTC at the university, and then I was accepted for the advanced course for the final 2 years of my time in the university, and at which time, when I graduated, I would have come out as second lieutenant in the Army. And had I not been colorblind, I have a very strong feeling that I would not now be giving this interview. The second lieutenants were more expendable at that time than the privates.
So colorblindness was a blessing?
It was, to that extent. It isn't very good for my driving ability with the red and green stoplights.
To go back to your childhood some, how many sisters and brothers did you have?
I have one sister and no brothers. And my sister still lives here at Monticello, at 718, I think it is, North State.
And her name is?
June Piatt Slavin.
What kind of games did you and your sister play when you were children? Since there was no TV to watch.
Well, that's right. There wasn't any TV, but we did listen to a lot of radio. Well, as everybody did. When we were my first memory is that radios were just coming in then. And my father got very interested in radios and, in fact, built 2 or 3 of them. So we had one of the first radios in Monticello. And the evenings were pretty much spent then listening to the radio like they are now watching television by a lot of people. As to games, I don't know. I can't remember what we played. I know we fought a lot.
Do you recall any of your favorite radio shows?
Yes. I think I can, anyway. There was, they had what they called the 2 Black Crows. They were, of course, white men that came on the radio as colored, and I thought, and I still think, they were just funny as they could be. Matter of fact, we went, when we were in Chicago one time, my father and mother took us to the radio station, and actually we were interviewed and came on the radio, and one of our neighbors, a boy younger than I am, thought it was something was wrong and wanted us to get out of that radio. He didn't see how we got in there.
You mentioned going to Chicago. Did you travel much when you were growing up?
We went to Chicago quite often, and then we took motor trips around the United States. Not too far, because I think Oklahoma and Colorado and the Black Hills were as far as we went west. There weren't very good roads, and the automobiles weren't too good either.
What was, do you remember when you saw your first automobile?
Well, as soon as yes, I can remember that. Just as long as I can remember. I remember just like it was yesterday, Mrs. Nell England, whom we all called Aunt Nell England, who, by the way, was the only daughter of the Kirbys, had a Packard twin 6 automobile. It was what they called a touring car, no windows, but she used to take me for a ride about every other day, and they had on that dashboard, there were all kinds of little buttons, it seemed to me like, that I continually pressed to see what would happen. And one time the part of the top went down.
What kind of roads were around here?
Well, there were mostly dirt roads, but what we called, and I'm not sure exact date, but I think I must have been 5 or 6 years old, they put in what we called, and which some of us that have been here a long time, the hard road, which is now presently 105 that goes north of here. There was a lot of discussion and a lot of controversy about that, because the original plan was to put route, which was Route 10 then, down State Street, and but the powers that be eliminated that were then, I should say.
That's a good thing, too.
Yes.
How long would it take your family to drive up to Chicago?
Not as long as you might think. It would take about a half a day. We first had to go to Danville and then up old Route 1, but then when 10 came in, we took 10 and then what is now 45, which parallels 57 now.
How would you get to Danville from here?
You go to Champaign and across.
Did you go in what we call Ridge Road?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And then north, and then there was a highway between the two, and then and I'm sure it's Route 1 that goes from Danville north to Chicago, and south too.
Yeah. What was Monticello like when you were a young boy? What kind of impressions do you have of the town as you grew up?
Well, I have many impressions, very fond memories too, for that matter. It in the period from 1922 until 1930 or 31, certainly no later than 32, most of these large homes, or mansions really, what they are, were built here in Monticello. And the Pepsi Syrup Company was built in that time. The old Moore Bank, which is now the National Bank of Monticello, was constructed then, and we were also given the Moore Gymnasium by the Moore family, which was built while I was in first grade. I attended it was 1926 or 7. I attended the opening ceremonies for that gymnasium. Sat on the first row because we were in the first grade. Mr. and Mrs. Moore were there, who donated the money to build the gymnasium, and as I recall, William F. Lodge was the master of ceremonies. When I was growing up here, Alan F. Moore, seemed to me to be on almost equal footing with the deity. He was a very handsome man, and he certainly looked the part of a millionaire. He could have been cast in any movie or any play or anything as a multi-millionaire or an executive or any other thing and been believable. And he's a very fine man. I knew him quite well, and he lost all of his money, by 1932 or 33. And in the early 20s, he'd constructed this large mansion out here, which was the original site of Kirby Hospital, but has since been torn down. And he had on this estate, he had also his own private tennis courts, a 9-hole golf course with grass greens, which at that time our other golf clubs still had sand greens, and a private swimming pool. It was really an outstanding home, and they were very generous with this estate. They asked their friends, and fortunately, which we were among, to use their golf course at certain times and to use their swimming pool. They quite often, as I recall, and I'm sure this is right, they sent their chauffeur around, usually around the Christmas time, about like we're talking now today, and he would, at least at our house, he left a couple of bottles of very fine whiskey, which at that time we were in Prohibition, and an invitation to use their swimming pool in the summer at certain hours on certain days, and the same with the golf course. After he lost his money, they lived out in the big house until about 1937, and the last 2 years that Mr. and Mrs. Moore lived there, I drove for them when they wanted to go out of town. My father and Alan Moore were very close friends, and I guess they thought that I would be available. I was a young man to drive them, and I drove Mr. Moore from Monticello to East St. Louis, and he had at that time a new Oldsmobile. And don't ask me how he got that Oldsmobile new, because he was supposed to be broke, but he had it. And I went out to the house and went in, and Mr. Moore was sitting in that huge library with his head up against a large radio phonograph combination, and I thought to myself, the old man's back in the grain market again. Maybe he's going to recover his money. But when I got over there, he was getting the results of the second race at Washington Park. And that is true. But when we started out to St. Louis, when we got on the other side of Decatur, at that time there was a sign that said 27 miles to Taylorville. And he reached over and he patted me on the knee and he said, "Now, boy, I want to make that in 25 minutes."
Wow.
Well, that was music to my ears. We had a new car, and away we went, and we made it in 25 minutes.
That's all you needed, right?
Yes. The old gentleman we went to a bank in East St. Louis, and he took me in with him, and then he went into the president's office carrying a little chamois bag. And when he came out, the president was with him, and we all went to lunch. And on the way back, he said, "I suppose you wonder what I took into that office in that chamois bag." And I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "Well, it's a few of the diamonds that I have left, and I had to pay a note down there." Very interesting man. And I drove several times for him after that.
And you said they continued to live in that mansion for a while after
Yes.
they lost their money?
Yes, and then they finally, there was a large sale. They sold all of the household goods, all their dishes, their silver and their crystal and all of the furnishings. There are pieces of this all over town now. With people who were here then, still some people have some of it. Then they moved to San Antonio, Texas, and a man by the name of Coquette, who Alan Moore had befriended many years before, was now in the oil business in Texas, and he gave Alan Moore a job. And Alan Moore and his wife lived in a suite in the St. Anthony Hotel, and pretty much luxury. I'll back up a minute and tell you too that I said that he built, or that Moore State Bank was built, and Alan Moore was president of that bank. And that bank did not open after the bank, or was closed before the bank moratorium went in, and the bank ceased to exist. And the depositors realized about 86 or 88 cents on the dollar. In other words, they lost quite a little bit of money. But there was never any criticism of Alan Moore. Everybody liked him. He was honest as he knew how to be, and he was just a victim of circumstance. He was a gambler. That's really how he lost his money on the grain market. Yeah, grain market in Chicago. That's the rest of it.
Okay. We were just discussing Mr. Moore, and we talked about the bank closing. Can you tell us a little about how the people reacted when the banks closed?
When the Moore Bank, we had two banks in Monticello, the Moore State Bank, and the other one was the First National Bank. The Moore State Bank closed, as I think I told you just a minute ago, about 3 days before President Roosevelt declared the bank moratorium, and at which time they closed all banks in the United States for a period of about a week. The Moore Bank closed before that. The First National Bank closed because of the moratorium, but they never reopened. And neither did the Moore Bank. As a matter of fact, we were here in Monticello without any bank, and there wasn't any money, and people didn't know what to do. And we banked finally in Trevin Mattis Bank in Champaign, and many other people did. Any bank that reopened after the moratorium.
How long did it take for people to get at least partial payments from the bank?
Well, it took quite a long time in these two banks here because they were both put into receivership, and the trustees and I'm going to say bankruptcy, but I'm not sure that's right. But the trustees took over, and they finally liquidated both bank of all the assets. There was a group of men in Monticello that got together and started this new bank, which is now the National Bank of Monticello. And I think that was about a year after the other banks closed. And they bought the Moore State Bank building, and that's where well, it's still the same location, but they.
How long after that did the state bank start of?
The State Bank started in 1946. I can tell you an interesting story about that too.
Okay.
I'm not sure I want all this published. There was a certain amount of dissatisfaction amongst some people with the National Bank of Monticello because they were beginning to make charges on depositing checks and the number of checks you wrote. And Mr. J.P. Kratz, a farmer south of town here, took a grain check in there for $30,000, and they charged him $3 to deposit that check. They were going to charge him $3 to deposit that check, but he never deposited it. And he took his account to the State Bank of Met, and shortly thereafter, he got a group of people together here in town, and they applied for and started the first. And that it opened in 1946 on the south side of the square, where I don't know. There's some little shop over there now. It's the one building next to the that hamburger place, whatever that.
Next to the Dairy Queen?
Yes, next to the Dairy Queen. That's where they opened, and they were there for I don't know, several years, and then they moved to their present location. But they had just half of that building, which was owned by the Kratz family, and have expanded from that time on.
You mentioned earlier Nell England and the Kirby family.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us a little bit about her?
Yes. I think I said earlier that we all called her Aunt Nell. And I shouldn't say we all did. Those of us that knew her, or she knew us. She helped, actually, she and her husband, Bert England, had no children. They had no children. And they helped raise my sister and myself, the Dighton boys, the Kratz boys, and Bill Burgess, Lou Burgess's father. And they took us all on as kind of as their own family. As a matter of fact, my cousin tells me that if my dad wouldn't buy me something, either Bert or Nell would, so I always got what I wanted. But she was the only daughter of John and Mary Kirby. And as you know, the Kirbys, John Kirby, left the trust fund and farmland subject to the life estate of his wife and his daughter for the building and operation of a hospital to be known as John and Mary Kirby Hospital. John Kirby died in 1919, and and I didn't ever know John Kirby because he was dead before I was born. But Mary Kirby lived till 1938. She was 98 years old, and I did know Mary Kirby. And I suspect that I'm one of the few left around here that didn't know Mary Kirby, because I knew her best because of her being at the England home, but she lived in a old St. Nicholas Hotel in Decatur or in California in the winter. But I want to tell you this, this is my opinion. Mrs. Kirby was not a lovable old woman. As a matter of fact, she was one of the most cantankerous people I ever knew. And I really didn't like her. And I knew her. I was 18 when she died. I knew her well enough to know a lot about her. She, at her death, however, this triggered the trust fund, and then the corporation was formed, and in her will, she left what the farms that she owned herself. not that her husband had owned, but she left them to this trust, which is now the Mary E. Kirby Trust, for the same purpose that her husband did. But she left a clause in her will that if something was not started 1 year after her death, her estate was to go to Decatur-Macon County Hospital. So they got busy, Mr. and Mrs. England and other people here in the community, and they bought the Moore home, the one I told you that they had moved out of, and they bought, and there's about 40 acres there, but they bought that whole home and started the renovation, and the Kirby Hospital opened its doors in 1941, and then it limped along for quite a long time because the only John Kirby left this $100,000 trust fund, which was a lot of money in 1990, which was really, at the time the hospital was started and after Mrs. Kirby's death, was all that they had. And the remainder of the farmland was his daughter, Nell England's, until her death. And so and she died in 1950. So for about 9 years, they had a very difficult time financially, and they passed the hat around here and raised enough money to keep it solvent until at the time of her death, then about 1,200 acres, no, more than that, about 1,500 acres came into the trust, and the combination now of the John and Kirby Trust and the Mary E. Kirby Trust are the fund the hospital.
Do you remember ever being treated at the hospital when it was fairly new?
No, thank goodness I've only been in that hospital once, overnight, and that's all. But
how many doctors serviced that hospital when it started?
we had at that time, I think there were about 4 doctors here. But you see, I said that's 41, and in December 41 and early 1942, the war started, and 2 or 3 of them were called into service. And the only doctor that was here during the war years that was really active was my uncle, Dr. Furry. And he took care of all the people in this community, and he almost killed himself doing it. Matter of fact, when I came back here in 1946, he'd aged so much I wasn't sure that I knew who he was, but he lived another 12 years.
When you went to the university, did you live there?
Yes.
Did you live on campus?
Yes. I was a member of a fraternity there.
What fraternity?
Phi Gamma Delta, which my son is also, and the Kratz family, who are relatives of ours, were all Phi Gams too. 401 East job.
And then after you got out of the service, what did you do?
I came back to Monticello, and I didn't know what I was going to do, but I did know that if possible, I wanted to live and to work here. And as I said previously, I got back in April of 46, and I thought I would have a month or two where I didn't do anything for a while. But Mr. Klein, the name of this agency is Burgess and Klein. Mr. Klein called me over to his house and said they were looking for a young man to start in the insurance agency, and would I be interested? And I was interested, and I started here in June 1946, and I've been here ever since.
You took to it rather well.
Well, apparently I did. Either that or I didn't know what else to do.
Who worked here when you began working here?
Mr. Klein was here, and he had another partner by the name of Clarence Bolenbach. And there were the 2 of them and me, and then Mrs. Marge Kuykendall, who still lives here in Monticello. Do you happen to know her?
No, I don't.
worked in here, and Francis Smith, and there was one other one, and I can't remember who it was now. Mr. Burgess, who had retired in 1940, and Mr. Bolenbach had bought out his interest. In 1953, Mr. Bolenbach died, who was the younger partner, and I bought his share of the business, and Dempsey Klein and I became partners. We didn't change the name. It was still Burgess and Klein. And in 1963, Mr. Klein died, and I bought his interest, and I've been sole owner since that time, never having changed the name, but it's been here since 1915.
Have you ever thought of changing the name seriously?
No, I never have, because, well, I guess for two reasons. First of all, the business has been here, as I said, since 1915. It is fairly well known in this area. Secondly, I didn't give a damn whether everybody knew whether I owned it or not. Now my son is a partner as of 1981, and we are still not considering changing the name.
You've got a good thing you wouldn't change your
Well, there's no reason to really.
Has the office always been located in this location?
It's been in this building since 1922, and in it was owned by the Tapman sisters, by the way, and with their father before them, and the building was built in 1884. There's a plaque out there in front by Cale Tapman, the father of Kip and Frank Tapman. And the way that Burgess and Klein got into this building was that Mr. Tapman was the president and secretary of the Piatt County Loan Association, and he wanted a place for it to be, and he wanted Mr. Klein to be secretary. So they came, and we had the Piatt County Loan in this building up until 10 or 12 years ago, whenever they went into insuring accounts, they couldn't operate in a building where there was another business. I bought this building in 1965 from what we call the Tapman girls, who at that time were about 75 years old, and remodeled it the same year.
What were the Tapman sisters like?
Very fine people. Very fine people. They were eccentric. They very close with the buck. But they, in the end, you know what their generosity has done because we have Tapman Village out here. They live very simple, very frugal lives. Ask for help from nobody. They inherited a good deal of farmland and money from their father, who died in 1927. These two sisters, I guess the term is maiden ladies, lived together on South Charter and weathered the Depression, and not only weathered it, bought about another 640 acres of land shortly after that. They were heavy investors in what was then the Illinois Joint Stock Land Bank, which you've probably never heard of. And that was one of Mr. Dighton's, William Dighton's properties.
What is that? Or is it still?
No,
exist?
No, it's liquidated. I told you there were two banks here. The First National Bank of Monticello was on the corner where the Candlewick Inn is now, and then where that coffee shop is, they had the Dighton Dilatois Loan Company, and where the cocktail room is, whatever they call that thing, was the Illinois Joint Stock Land Bank. There were three financial institutions there, and of all three, William Dighton was the president of each. And when the Illinois Joint Stock Land Bank liquidated, the money that the Tapmans had in it, they used to buy this other land. One other interesting sidelight of that Joint stock land bank. I have trouble saying that.
It is hard to say.
Robert Allerton was a director, and when he received his part of the liquidation, he endorsed the check and sent it to the Art Institute.
I've seen his name up here.
Well, that's now the Robert Allerton building, you know. When he died in 1963 or 4, he left two-thirds of his estate to the Art Institute in Chicago and one-third to the Honolulu Academy of Arts or something like that.
Did people lose money when that
Yes.
land bank was liquidated?
Not the land bank, but the First National Bank, they did. And they didn't lose money in the bank. I'll have to back up and explain that a little to you. The bank actually paid out 111%. And on these details, I'm not exactly positive, but I know what I've heard from people that knew. There was some accommodation, what they called accommodation notes in those banks, in that bank, where they would, Mr. Dighton or some member of his family would put in a note for $10,000 just to make the books balance. And actually, Mr. Dighton spent a year as a guest of the federal government in Ohio.
They didn't care for that practice.
No, but in my opinion, it was a travesty on justice. That bank paid out, as I said, 111%, and one of the reasons that they finally got him was that when Mr. Dighton was a very cocky individual and a very good-looking man too, as I said about Mr. Moore, and he ran things pretty much with an iron hand. And they sent a young bank examiner down here years ago, and Mr. Dighton didn't like what he was doing, so he called the comptroller of the currency in Washington and said, "There's a young whippersnapper in here trying to tell me how to run my bank, and I want him out." Well, they took him out, all right. But when the moratorium came, that bank examiner that he had kicked out of his bank was in the King seat in Chicago, and that examiner returned the favor. He kicked Mr. Dighton out.
We touched on the Depression. Was your family affected by the Depression very much?
Some, not as much as many of these people that I've talked a little bit about, the Moores and the Dightons, lost everything. We didn't have anywhere near as much to start with, but we really didn't lose anything. They were tough times. You didn't have any money, to speak of, and I was only 12 or 13 years old when all this was going on, and consequently, I've really been running scared ever since, because I saw these things happen almost overnight. It seemed like where there were about 7 or 8 very, very wealthy families here, and most of them lost a good part of what they had.
Was it because they had invested in stocks for the most part?
Well, I told you that Mr. Moore lost his in the grain market, and of course the Dightons lost it through this bank fiasco, and others had mortgaged land, and they thought then, the 20s were really golden years, and they thought this would never stop, but it did, and the values all went to hell, and lots of them lost a good deal of land, and those that were, these people lived pretty high too. When I was a kid, there were 5 chauffeur-driven limousines in this little country town.
Who besides, you mentioned the Moores?
Yes, and their son, Bradford Moore, did. John Hott, whom we haven't touched upon. William Dyken, who had the best-looking Packard limousine I ever saw, and Robert Allerton. And they would be driven around this little country square, you know.
Did the Hops lose any money? Or
They not too much.
how about Allerton? Did he lose?
Allerton didn't lose anything. He lost some value in his stocks, but he said he didn't care as long as the dividends were paid. And on paper, he lost a lot, but it came back. And Allerton spent a lot of time here in his home, which is now Allerton Park, during the Depression. But in about 1935 or 6, somewhere like that, he and his companion, or now adopted son, John Gregg, took a trip around the world, so they weren't hurt too badly.
Did you ever go to any of the famous Allerton parties?
I was there when I was a kid, but I really don't remember very much about it. Now, I never went to anywhere famous. I was there at a party. I knew Robert Allerton pretty well, better long towards the end of his life, and after he moved to Hawaii in 1946 or 7, somewhere in there. Then he continued to maintain this home out here behind Elmer Preeb's, that little frame house. And he came back every year for two weeks, and always the same time of year. And he always stopped in here at the office. Matter of fact, he would stop in at least once, because he had his personal property tax returns, and he would sign them and I would notarize them for him. Matter of fact, he's the real cause of me remodeling this building.
Oh, why is that?
He came in here one May and he looked around and he said, "Don, this place hasn't changed in 50 years. You should do something about it." So I did.
So you had a year before he came back to do something.
But the unfortunate part of it is that he died before he saw it.
He didn't know it.
No, but his son, John Gregg Allerton, did, and he still comes. Still comes back every year, you know, and he follows the same pattern. He makes the same calls. He was in here last May. We had a little visit.
How old is his son now?
He's 82.
Is he that old?
Yes. He was adopted, you know, when he was 60-something. Mainly for tax purposes, I'm sure.
Well, now after you started working in the insurance business here, somewhere along the line you met your wife.
Yes. I surely did.
When did you meet? Did you grow up together?
No. She was from Brownstown, Illinois, down near Vandalia. And where were we now?
You were telling me about meeting your wife.
Well, she, as I said, she's born in Brownstown, Illinois, near Vandalia. She came here to teach school in 1937 or 8, I think, and then I knew her then, but she married James Piatt Kratz II, and in 1942, I believe. And he was then called into the Army, and maybe it was 43, I don't know. Anyway, he was in the Army, and was killed in Belgium in Patton's Third Army. And his daughter was born, Tamsin was born after his death. She never knew her father. And then when I came back in 1946, we started going together, and we were married in 1947. And our daughter, and that's the way I feel about her, and she does about me also, was 3 years old at that time. So, and then our son, Dyke, was born in 1949.
Do you recall your first date with your wife?
No, I don't. But don't tell her.
We should put on record, what is your wife's name?
Carleen, Karleen.
And after you were married, where did you first live?
We first lived on East Grant Street, right behind Vince Walsh. He owned those two houses. His son lives there now, and what they call the cottage, and where Vince's widow now lives. We lived there for 5 years, and then we bought the home that we now live in on Moore State Street.
What churches and organizations have you belonged to in Monticello?
Well, I was baptized a Methodist, and I went to the Presbyterian Church when I was younger, mainly because there was a lady here by the name of Mrs. Savage that used to come around and pick us up and take us to Sunday school, and that was at the Presbyterian Church. She made sure we were there. And so I don't know really, but I went in the Navy. I had a star on both flags, so I don't think either one of them claim me. I am not a churchgoer. I'm not a very good religious man, I should say. My wife is a very devout Methodist. She goes without me.
What organizations have you belonged to in town?
Well, you name them, and I've been in them. Yes. As a matter of fact, I'm still serving on about 5 boards here. I'm the treasurer of the Kirby Hospital. I've been on that board for 25 years, 26 years, I guess. I'm on the board of directors of the Monticello Grain Company. I've been on that board since 1953. That's getting close to 30 years, isn't it? I was on the Piatt County Loan Association board for about 20 years until they merged with Champaign Loan and Building. One of my best boards, and where I have the very least trouble from our customers, is the cemetery board.
No, you didn't have much trouble at all.
They don't complain at all. I've been on the cemetery board for a good long time. I'm now president of the board of trustees and have been for some time. At this time, I'm also president of the Dumore Corporation. I was vice president of the Monticello Industrial Development Corporation. I've served on the school board for 6 years. I've been on the Chamber of Commerce board on and off over the years. I haven't been active in it in the last few years. That's
what of these organizations do you feel like has been the most rewarding for you?
the most personally. I'm talking personally now. The most rewarding to me has been John and Mary Kirby Hospital. I forgot to tell you I was on Tapman Village Board too. I went on that board for 2 reasons. First of all, I wanted to carry out the dearest wish of my good friend, more than friend, Nell England, whose dearest wish was the perpetuation of Kirby Hospital. I wanted to do what I could to see that her wishes were carried out. And secondly, it's something that this town needs, and it's been very rewarding. I want to tell you right now, though, you're a young lady, that if you ever expect to serve on any of these things and get any thanks for it, forget it. Now, I'm sure that people appreciate it, but they never tell you this. What they do tell you is, instead of saying you're doing a good job, they want to know what in the hell you're doing out there now.
That's typical.
Now, did I answer that question?
Mm-hmm. Did you ever ride the Interurban?
Yes. God, I'm sounding like an old man, don't I? I used to ride the Interurban to school.
You did?
Oh, yes. Quite often. Right here in Monticello.
To when you went to the
To Champaign.
Oh, to the
No, I mean to the university.
I thought you went
Oh, no,
across town.
no, to the university. And yes, I rode that quite often, and sometimes to Decatur. And the longest ride I ever took was to Springfield. I went down there to pick up a car, as I recall.
Was it always just one passenger car?
That's all I remember, just the one. And it's had its own locomotion, its own motor, you know. And,
How much did it cost to go to Champaign?
I can't tell you exactly. I'm sure it was under $1.
Do you recall how long it took you?
I think about a half an hour, and they would stop if they're all gone now. But there used to be on that right of way between here and Champaign, there were little small shelters at intersections of country roads, and if there was anybody there waiting to get on that interurban, they'd stop and let them on.
So the train couldn't have moved at a very great speed then?
No, but it went fast enough. Of course, we used to ride the train here all the time, the Wabash, and up until not very long ago, we went to Chicago on that train. Of course, the last one they had, that Bluebird, was really a very nice train. It's too bad we still don't have it.
Too bad we don't have a lot of the trains.
Yes.
How has the square changed since you've had a business up here?
Well, it's there haven't been any radical changes except the renovations that have gone on, and of course the National Bank being one, and the State Bank another, and then this whole row of buildings here from the bank to the Raycraft's corner, which is all part of the long-range plan of the Dumore Corporation, which I mentioned to you that I am now president of. I don't mean that I did it, but the corporation did. We feel that we accomplished our purpose somewhat anyway. We formed to see that the downtown area of Monticello, and in particular around the square, wasn't allowed to go downhill and have lots of empty old buildings. And our first purchase, we bought the building next door to this office from the Tatmans again, and then we bought the